Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
One of the greatest of all Irishmen, Oscar Wilde, responded to the charge that he was in the gutter with the famous riposte, "We are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking up at the stars." Our guest on the Sputnik today could never be accused of being in the gutter, but he has joined the firmament of trailblazing pioneers who have been prepared to sacrifice to move everyone else forward, like Oscar Wilde himself.
Senator David Norris joined the Senate when Ireland was a more conservative country than it is now. The church was yet to begin its spectacular fall from grace, and an openly gay man in the corridors of power caused many a splutter over the Irish breakfast.
As well as changing the law which jailed Oscar Wilde and fighting for gay marriage equality, Senator Norris never forgot that the Good Samaritan never passes by on the other side of the road, however far away those suffering are.
His speech in the Irish Senate as Gaza burned in the summer of 2014 has to be seen and heard to be believed. Its power and eloquence, positively Oscar Wilde-like.
After a build-up like that, you'll be glad to know he's here on the show, on board the Sputnik. Senator, thank you so much for joining us. You're a personal hero of both of us. It's an honour to have you here, and I don't often say that, and if I do, I very rarely mean it, but I mean it today.
Well, it's an honour and a pleasure to be here with both you and Gayatri.
Thank you so much, Senator. Now, the centenary of the first blow to the empire, the rising of Easter 1916, and the GPO, and the heroes of what became the Irish Republic is almost upon us. So we thought we'd take an early look at that centenary. How would you summarise the gains that Ireland has made through the independence struggle? What have the 100 years of Irish freedom actually produced?
Well, I'm glad that we have an independent parliament, and I think that Mr de Valera, as Taoiseach or Prime Minister of Ireland, was very wise to keep Ireland out of the Second World War, although very positively engaged towards Britain. About the Rising, I have more mixed feelings, because so many of the people involved were of English origin. People like Padraig Pearse, who had an English Protestant father, and who wrote in extremely racially abusive terms in On Clive Sullish. I mean, I've read a lot of the writings of these people. I admire Connolly, but the Rising itself was deeply unpopular in the Ireland of that time. It was only after the British shot the leaders that sympathy turned round. And if you look at what the immediate aftermath of the Rising was, it was a brutal and bitter civil war and the division of the island. So I think there are all kinds of questions about it. I don't think we should look on it uncritically. I remember the 50th anniversary, and it was an exclusively Catholic, Republican, heterosexual, white affair. And if you didn't fit into those categories, you were out on your ear.
Like the Tet Offensive in
Yes.
Vietnam, it was a military failure, but a political success, a strategic success.
Yes, it was. And the people involved in it, they were largely school teachers, trade unionists. They were dreamers, and they dreamed this thing. But if you look at it, Home Rule had already been passed. It was shelled for the First World War, and they attacked the state when it was in very difficult circumstances in the First World War. And people forget that one of the ideas was to put a branch of the Hohenzollern family onto the throne of Ireland. And I don't think that would have been such a wonderful idea. So I take a rather mixed view of it. And if you look, for example, at Countess Markovich, she was a scion of an English-based the other woman who Yeats was so, Maud Gonne, she was completely English. And she first saw Ireland from the inside of the Curragh camp, where her father was a colonel in the British Army. So, whereas I can understand the energy and the resolve and the zeal for independence and freedom of these people, I very much regret the racial, the anti-English aspect of the thing.
This was inevitable, though, with an overbearing near neighbour occupying you, seeking to obliterate your culture, your language, and to entirely dominate your economic and strategic future. And as you rightly say, if the British had not responded to the Easter Rising in the brutal, bloody way that they did, I myself was brought up with a tearful grandfather telling me how they tied James Connolly to a chair in order to execute him.
And they gave him medical attention so that he'd be well enough to be shot. I mean, but I feel more sympathy with the young people, many of them Irish, many of them 16 years old, who are shot at dawn because they were shell-shocked, and in their shell-shocked condition, they had neglected to take their cap off in the presence of an officer. That, to my mind, was the real blasphemy. But the First World War, in my opinion, was a huge mistake.
Yes, indeed.
If I'd been around, I would have fought for Franz Josef. Because
I'd have fought for all of them to turn their guns on their officer class and march to their own capitals and overthrow their ruling classes, but as the Russian people did. But that's another matter. A century of independence, though. How different is Ireland today to what it would have been had it remained under British rule?
Well, I think we probably would have still been, to a certain extent, subservient. It's a matter of debate as to how much freedom we'd have got under the Home Rule Bill, because the British Parliament were concerned at looking after the interests of the Ulster Unionists and so on and so forth. I think we would have been fairly independent and developed dominion status, rather like Canada and so on, but have kept the crown. And I have to say, the royal family are very popular in Ireland. The Queen's visit was a huge
Even Martin
success.
McGuinness took tea with Her Majesty in Buckingham Palace, wearing a white tie and tails.
Absolutely. And of course, the Queen is a lot more Irish than some of the revolutionaries, because she's a descendant, direct descendant 3 times over, of Brian Boru, one of the last High Kings of Ireland, who defeated the Danes at Clontarf in 1014. And once she's a direct descendant of Hugh O'Neill, the rebel Earl of Tyrone.
My goodness, I didn't know that. I didn't expect to.
We see, we're all so mixed up. We're two small islands, and there's been a constant interchange since really prehistoric times between the people. So that's why I deprecate any kind of racially based tension. I think it is a real pity. The same as I feel it with religion. I think it's such a shame that 2 Christian denominations should be so antagonistic towards each other, historically speaking.
Now, Connolly predicted that partition would lead to a carnival of reaction in the north.
And it did,
and
on
it
both sides of the border.
And we saw it actually this week with the unionist last-ditch stand against gay rights, for example.
Yes. Ably supported in the background by the Roman Catholic hierarchy, which I thought was rather an irony of these 2 forces coming together. But on the other hand, something near 70% of people in Northern Ireland said in a survey released last night that they would not be troubled by a close member of their family engaging in a same-sex marriage. Now, that's rather interesting. And the Assembly passed a resolution about gay marriage for the first time in Belfast, and that was scuppered by the introduction of a particular device by the Democratic Unionist Party. Totally undemocratic.
What this tends to suggest is that the people, north and south, are no longer following the instruction of the hierarchy on either side of that religious divide. That the Democratic Unionist Party, of course, win elections, but their reactionary views are not supported by any means by all Protestant people in the north. And the Roman Catholic Church, as Gayatri said in the introduction, has had quite a spectacular fall from grace in Ireland. When I used to go to Ireland as a child, the Catholic Church was all-powerful,
Right.
absolutely all-powerful.
Well, in fact, in the 1950s, as I remember quite well, cabinet...
Unfortunately, I'm talking about the 1950s.
Well, cabinet documents and policy was sent for review and for the imprimatur of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, and if then they said no, it just didn't pass. That has completely gone now, and that's a very good thing.
So no Pope hanging in families' living rooms anymore?
Oh, I think they do, yes. And I have to say...
Especially this Pope.
Oh,
He's
exactly.
worth listening
Well,
to.
He is, don't you agree? Pope Francis, I think he's absolutely
fabulous.
terrific, and I'm an Anglican. But he is so human. The previous two were unspeakably arrogant.
We're on the same page on many things. Now, the fact of independence meant that you had an independent parliament and means you have an independent Senate, something we could do with here. You're in advance
Luckily,
of us.
because the Prime Minister tried to abolish it.
Oh, really? Which
Yes,
Prime Minister?
Enda Kenny, the present Prime Minister, about 2 years ago. And I was in hospital with a cancer operation, and this had started off, and I'd called a meeting, but two of my colleagues took the issue and fought everybody else off. And I thought, well, all right, as long as they win. But they weren't winning. And I got out of hospital with 2 weeks to go, and I said, get off the stage. Other people have to get involved in this now. And Professor John Crown, Dr. Sean Barrett, and myself, within 10 days, we reversed the figures and made it a 60-40 victory for the Senate.
Now, you have been a senator almost 30 years. What impact did having Ireland's first out gay political representative, political leader, what impact did that have at the time?
Well, I wasn't aware of it, but apparently the paint on the ceiling in the members' dining room nearly came off with all the comments they were making about me, and they were all saying, backs to the wall as he goes past. They fancy themselves. I wouldn't look sideways at one of them. You know, it's the amazing thing about heterosexual men of middle age and corpulence. They think every gay person's trying to jump at them.
Yeah.
But there were some difficulties, but I always treated it with amusement. I remember one day, when I just left the Senate, one of my colleagues, Willie Farrell, said, described me as a pervert. And the next day they tried to make him apologise and withdraw it. And I said, oh, come on, stop torturing poor Willie. I wasn't the slightest bit insulted. You can only be insulted by somebody for whom you have respect. And Willie knows perfectly well I've no respect for him at all.
Very good. Wow.
That's the spirit. More of this after the break. Welcome back to Sputnik. They say never meet your heroes. Gayatri and I have, as one of our heroes, Senator David Norris, who's with us today, and so far it's going really well. She said earlier that his famous speech in the Senate as Gaza burned in the summer of 2014 has to be seen and heard to be believed. She's right about that. Here's a clip.
I'm not anti-Israeli, I'm not anti-Semitic. I supported the State of Israel. But in the 40 years that I've known the State of Israel and sometimes had a home there, I've seen it completely change. It changed from a left-wing, socially directed country to an extreme right-wing regime that is behaving in the most criminal fashion and defying the world and unscrupulously using the Holocaust to justify what they're doing. And it's time that rag was torn away from them.
Senator, I know a thing or two about oratory, and that's one of the most wonderful pieces of oratory I have ever seen in any parliament. Tell us the circumstances that lay behind it.
Well, you're very kind. What happened was that I wrote to the Cahill, the chairman of the Senate, asking for the Senate to be recalled because I was so horrified by what was happening in Gaza. And to my amazement, they agreed to recall the Senate in the middle of the summer. And so it was that on my 70th birthday, I spent the day in the Senate, just out of hospital, and that's why I'm kind of leaning up against the back of the chair.
I thought it was just a Churchillian pose, actually.
No, but it
You could hardly stand up, in fact.
Well, it came really from the heart, because I know that part of the country. I've been to Israel. I had an apartment in Israel. We had Palestinian friends. I've been in Gaza. I've seen the circumstances in which those unfortunate people are forced to live. And I have to say that the operations of the Israeli government are a blasphemy against the ethos of Judaism.
Sure, and you made
And
that
that's why
point
it's
very
so,
powerfully.
It's so important
There is
that there are people like my friend Ezra Yitzhak Nawi, who's Jewish and Israeli, and for those people, for Israeli Jews, to stand up, confront and challenge the iniquitous behaviour of the government is so powerful.
Indeed they are, and he and Professor Ilan Pape, Professor
Yes.
Norman Finkelstein and so on, such people and their activities, their words are more powerful even than any that you or I could summon.
And even they are denounced as being anti-Semitic.
They are, yeah,
You know,
they
it's
are.
astonishing.
Although how one could be Jewish and anti-Semitic
Yes.
has always been beyond me. But the senators around you, as sometimes used to happen to me in the British House of Commons, looked a bit shell-shocked. They looked a bit speechless. How did they respond to your magnificent speech?
They responded very well, and almost all of them took a similar line, some a little bit gentler. And you see, the thing is, many people in Ireland looked to Israel and supported Israel, particularly after the catastrophe of the Holocaust. But it gradually dawned on people that the Palestinians were being made to pay for the crime of the Europeans, with which they had nothing whatever to do. And so I've seen, over the last 40 or 50 years, a real turnaround in Irish attitudes, because we tend to go with the underdog. And the Palestinians are now so clearly the underdog. And some of the Israelis have said to me, how could you possibly support these people? Look at the way they treat gay people. But that doesn't really catch with me at all. It is a question of fundamental human rights, and you have to stick with the human rights even of people who don't believe in human rights. Even they have human rights. And I've always thought, if you look around the Mediterranean basin at so many countries where there's been the popular election of an Islamic government, and the West always undermines and subverts it. They've never been given the chance. In any of these countries, in Egypt, in Algeria, in Palestine, I mean, the Hamas won a victory. I don't like them particularly. I doubt if they would like me, but they won a victory. They should be allowed to make their mistakes. That's what democracy is about. And the West has consistently subverted democracy all over the Middle East.
You see, I'm wondering if this attitude, and it seems to me to be quite widely shared in Ireland, towards the issues of human rights, is itself a product of having once been an occupied country, a subject country. Because there are proportionally far more supporters, active supporters of the Palestinian cause in Ireland than there are in Britain. There's a generally progressive attitude towards certainly issues of occupation and issues of suppression of human rights. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yes, I would. Absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. And although I take a complex view of the revolution and the post-revolutionary period, if I look up in the north and I see the still devastating trouble from a plantation that's over 400 years ago. And then I look at the Middle East and I think to myself, is this going to last for 400 years as well? And then the Irish people have the memory of the famine, when so many people, millions of people died or had to leave the country. And then there are these terrible, terrible scenes of eviction. Landlords evicting ordinary, decent Irish, hard-working people and rack renting. Every time a tenant farmer improved their land, the rent was put up. So they had no chance of getting out of misery and poverty. And I think that left a memory in people.
Well, you see, you touched on the 6 counties there, and there is another parallel. This is the centenary, the eve of the centenary of the Irish Rising. But very soon, there will be the centenary of the Balfour Declaration.
Yes.
One of the pieces of correspondence going between Balfour and Lord Rothschild talked of the implantation of a little Jewish Ulster for Britain in the Middle East. It was, in a sense, the same imperial motivation and impulse. The plantation was so that Britain could place, if you like, a cat's paw or a dagger at the heart of any nascent Irish nationalism, and the implantation of the State of Israel was for the same imperial reasons. I mean, Britain gave away Palestine before it even possessed it
Yes.
as an imperial possession. And it's the only case where, on behalf of one people, Balfour promised to a second people the land that belonged to a third people. Perfidious Albion or what?
Well, there's a terrible arrogance, but it's all throughout the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire collapsed. I mean, if you look, for example, at Kuwait, you have a border that goes straight up from the coast, takes a right angle, another right angle, neatly enclosing the then known oil reserves. So that means Saddam Hussein was quite right. Kuwait was part of Iraq.
It was indeed. It was part of the Walayat of Basra.
Yes.
Tam Dalyell, my longtime parliamentary colleague, his father was the political secretary to Sir Percy Cox, the British resident in Iraq, who was in the tent when Sir Percy Cox drew that straight line and partitioned Iraq for British selfish imperial interests. And the same happened in Ireland.
Yes, absolutely. But if you look at the situation in Iraq, I remember protesting vigorously at the time of the bombing of the Kurds at Halabja. I was in Iraq, in Baghdad, and I had a shouting match over human rights with Tariq Aziz, to such an extent that our foreign minister said to me on the way out, I sincerely hope Norris will get out of this place alive after what you just said to him. But looking at it, the American and British intervention there was an utter disaster. And what's left there now is a complete and absolute catastrophe. Living under Saddam Hussein, and I saw the country under Saddam Hussein, was so much better. It was a secular, Western-orientated country. Yes, there were police, there was secret police, there was torture, there were all kinds of appalling human rights abuses. But having said that, it was better than what came after it, which is a sectarian bloodbath.
You mentioned in your epic speech, Tony Blair, you said he should keep his face out of the Middle East. You placed some of the responsibility for what was happening in Gaza upon him. We've just finished, just this week, the last word on our film, The Killings of Tony Blair. Looking back now, how would you summarize the era of Tony Blair in the politics of this region and the politics of the Middle East region?
Well, unspeakable, just appalling. And the idea that this man, with his track record, is now given an important position in the Middle East process is outrageous. I mean, what would the Palestinians think of the intervention of this man with blood on his hands, with a record of dishonesty on the issue? You know, the massaging of MI5 reports and all this kind of stuff, the idea that there were weapons of mass destruction and all this kind of stuff, and then the American voices in the background saying that they were going to blow Iraq back into the Stone Age. Well, that's what they did, and it's a disgrace.
Will Ireland be united in the lifetime of at least my children?
Well, I don't know. I think these issues are becoming more and more irrelevant. I mean, the border was a very serious thing some years ago, but nowadays you drive up and down, nobody knows the slightest bit of difference. There are no border posts, there's nothing. There's a good deal of cooperation in agriculture, in tourism, and so on and so forth. And I think it will happen like that, rather than any kind of Sinn Féin-inspired nationalistic thing. Borders are melting away across Europe, and I see it as part of that process. Now, interesting, in the last couple of days, there was a survey done in Northern Ireland and the Republic, and it showed that it was only a minority of people who actually wanted a united Ireland. And when you included the idea of, would you support a united Ireland if it led to an increase in your tax, the number of people supporting on both sides of the border absolutely plummeted. So people have it as a nice, hazy idea. It would look nice on a stamp, but they're not going to pay any extra tax money, let alone put their lives on the line for it. So I think as long as we have good neighbourliness, and that is increasingly shown. I mean, to me, it was utterly astonishing that Paisley and the Sinn Féin, McGuinness could sit down and become the Chuckle Brothers. You know, that was astonishing. And I didn't like either of those two parties particularly, but it is very good to see them sitting down. But I think they should be looking at the grassroots. Forget about the Union Jack on Belfast Town Hall. Forget about the tricolour. Get down and look at social services, hospital waiting lists, schools, education, and cooperate. That's the way forward, because what people really want is an improvement in their living standards, not some kind of abstract notion of flags and emblems and all the rest of it.
It has been an absolutely fascinating interview. I hope the viewers think so too. Senator David Norris, pleasure having you on board the Sputnik.
Thank you so much, George and Gayatri.
It's been a sad week for us on Sputnik with the loss of our esteemed and much-loved colleague Mohsen Faraj. He created the entire look and sound of the Sputnik. So with the closing titles today, we'd ask you to remember him as we do, fondly and forever.